Pretty much nobody would mind if Togashi kept writing the story while another artist would take care of the art. Togashi art is really secondary to his writing. I agree. I mean, I'm sure that somebody would mind, but I think that most of us would be pretty okay with this. There are certain manga series where I think that art and story are inseparable. One Piece, for example. The author Eiichiro Oda basically makes up the story according to what he wants to draw. So if he thinks of a cool silhouette, then he'll write a dramatic character introduction, and if he thinks of, say, an action composition, then he will write a fight just to draw that panel. Hunter x Hunter is kind of the opposite. Togashi draws more as a mechanism to get his story out, but I don't think that the art itself is his passion. If we're being honest, manga is a bit of a love-hate medium for Mr. Togashi. In the past, he has stated a distaste for almost all components of manga production, with the exception of story. I would not complain at all if Hunter x Hunter got another artist who could mimic Togashi's style. In fact, I wouldn't even complain if Togashi just decided to novelize the rest of Hunter x Hunter. I know it's a classic joke that reading Hunter x Hunter is like reading a novel anyway, but that aside, I would be legitimately excited to read a real Succession War novel. With that said, the most ideal world is to let Togashi tell his own story on his own terms. And if he wants to draw it himself, then that's the thing it is that he's gonna do. So let's have some more controversial opinions. Togashi's art is really good. Is this controversial? I mean, I guess it is. Most art is highly subjective, but Hunter x Hunter in particular occupies a very weird space with art. And I'm not even talking about the latter half of the series, where Togashi's condition heavily impacted his drawing. I mean, from the very get-go, it's a love or hate art style. It's very, and I don't mean this in a negative way, but it's very simplistic, very evocative of a lot of 70s and 80s type manga, which makes sense. That would have been Togashi's influence. And there's a lot I like about it. The clean, flat style does make things very easy to follow and digest, because rarely is something drawn on page that isn't 100% necessary. The things I don't like about the visuals are less to do with the art itself per se, and more how Togashi uses his art to convey certain things, like say time passing or location changing. So for example, at the beginning of the Chimera Ant arc, Gon, Killua, and Kite travel across the world between chapters. It just happens like that. You finish one chapter, you pick up the next one, they're there. And Togashi doesn't give you any visual assistance in depicting this time passing, it just happens. And mate, that's a lot of time that just happens. And a whole new location that we're supposed to be in that you may miss. And yeah, I get it, you don't need to show every step of the journey, but I think some connective tissue is helpful in a series as dense as Hunter x Hunter. Maybe even just an opening singular panel of a plane having landed. Because I think things can get unnecessarily confusing due to the lack of a clear sense of time and location. Here's something fun though. Togashi very often uses his quote-unquote bad art to his advantage. One panel that really struck me was during the Hunter exam where Killua was confronting Illumi, and the way Togashi drew the background was very wavy and sketchy, but not in a hyper-stylized way. The art itself was more like someone who had never picked up a pen was trying to draw the background, which perfectly fits the scene because it's showing Killua's world breaking down. The firm, solid, masterful lines are now devolving into a child trying to draw their first comic, which really hit home how young Killua is and just how much he's at the mercy of Illumi. However, with that said, if you'd shown me that panel out of context, then I probably would have called it objectively bad art. Genthru was a much more talented Nen user than people give him credit for, so this was a very popular, unpopular opinion, which means I'm not even sure if it's actually a controversial opinion anymore. But Genthru was very impressive when you think about what he did. Countdown utilizes 3 different Nen affinities: emission, manipulation, and Genthru's natural conjuration. That's very impressive because emission is the weakest affinity for conjurers, and manipulation isn't exactly the friendliest either. Although I do think this turns into a discussion of talent versus desire. Genthru's desire to blow the crap out of people in the most sadistic way possible was so strong that he pushed beyond his limits and tapped into affinities that logically he has no business using. Oh, and because this is Genthru, I will never not bring this up, but one of the countdown bombs is seen very suspiciously on this man's crotch, which means that Genthru must have touched it to plant the bomb, so they must have had a very interesting and probably very heated discussion. Imagine being that guy. The bomb appears on your junk and everyone just looks at you like, dude, what were you doing? Kikyo Zoldyck is super underrated. She adds so much to the family dynamics and an overall character of the Zoldicks with only small amounts of screen time. Kikyo definitely doesn't get enough appreciation. Quite specifically from the actual author of the series, Kikyo feels like a very neglected character. What fascinates me about Kikyo is the fact that she's from Meteor City. So the Zoldyck family probably have a process of incorporating, how shall we say, birthing partners into the family business. But also Kikyo has one of the most intriguing visual design with her visor, which weirdly enough kind of evolves backwards. In flashbacks, Kikyo has this very sleek and modern visor. However, in the actual modern day, she wears this clunky VR looking headset that encompasses her whole head. And I just think that's an interesting historical footnote. Togashi first drew Kikyo in the 90s when tech was very clunky and awkward, phones were bricks. But by the time he drew this flashback, we were in 2011, maybe even 2012, when tech had become much more sleek. The brick phones had turned into like funky iPhones. So as a result, past Kikyo, who was drawn in the future, gets a more modern device, whereas modern Kikyo drawn in the past gets a clunky piece of tech. Also, Kikyo has one of the weirdest romanized names being, and I don't think I'm going to pronounce this correctly, Kikyo Zoldyck. And I'm honestly convinced that whoever wrote that accidentally lent on the K key a bit too long and they just left it in. But now, more Zoldyck opinions. Illumi had a much worse life than Killua. Being the oldest, Illumi was most likely used as a test subject for training techniques and was also trained by the adults, Kikyo, Zeno, and Silver. So basically whatever he did to Killua, he probably had done to him 10 times worse. This is interesting because I think it could go both ways. As the firstborn, Illumi was likely honed in on a bit more intensely. There was probably a lot of pressure to get him right, so to speak. Whatever right is for a family of assassins. I mean, there are times when I look into Illumi's cold, dead eyes, and I wonder if he was born that way, or if this is the result of him just being broken as a human. And maybe they were even a bit reckless with Illumi. You know, the whole, if we fail with Illumi, then yeah, we'll just keep popping out spawn until we get one of them right. But then again, Killua is recognized as the most naturally talented of his siblings. So he also could have been trained with an even higher degree of scrutiny. And of course, Killua was partially raised by Illumi as well. And whether that made his situation better or worse is almost impossible to tell. I say almost, it's definitely impossible to tell. Illumi genuinely cares for Killua, so that may have made him a bit softer, or it might have made him a lot harsher, with the whole idea of, but this is for the good of my brother and all that. Tough love. Tough Zoldyck torturous assassin love. The Gon versus Morel fight is one of the best in the show in terms of foreshadowing and plot. I guess this really doesn't get talked about a lot because, well, it really isn't a fight, but it does lay some very important foundation. This is the precursor for Gon losing himself with Pitou because he does the same thing here with Morel. When Morel asked Gon to pretend that he was the one who killed Kite, that was a potentially life-ending mistake because Gon was not in control of the situation and he may very well have killed Morel if Killua had not stepped in to bring him back. It stresses that Killua is really the only thing retaining Gon's humanity at this point, so when Gon ultimately does cast Killua aside during the palace invasion, that's when we know that Gon is going to some serious dark places, because that final barrier is no longer there. Gon's angst in the Chimera Ant arc was wasted from Kite being reincarnated, and would have been better if he stayed dead, as it honestly feels very unlikely we'll ever see him, her again. You know, many years later, I'm still not sure how I feel about this, to be honest, because I generally hate bringing characters back to life. As an author, if you choose to kill a character, then I as a reader respect that. However, if you then bring the character back, then it makes me think that you think you've made a mistake. It breaks the immersion, because it feels like the narrative equivalent of hitting the undo button. You killed a character and later on think, oh no, maybe I shouldn't have done that. Just don't bring them back. Just leave them dead. Let the dead rest. With that said, I do think Kite's situation is a bit different though, because the Chimera Ant arc as a whole has this idea of identity, which it tends to explore through reincarnation. The ideas of, are humans still the same people after having been reborn as ants? Can they reclaim their humanity? Which they actually tend to. Most of the ants become emotional, sympathetic characters like your Calgos and your the chameleon. Whereas a lot of the humans tend to actually devolve into the instinctual monsters. So adding Kite back into the mix is just another layer of that idea. If I had to guess, and this would be a very optimistic guess, I would say that Kite may have been intended to act as a counterbalance to Gyro, a strong Nen-using protagonist who can flourish with newfound ant abilities. But the problem with that is that it banks on Kite being used in the future, which, just like the controversial opinion holder, I'm not sure him, her will be. And I know that some people also argue that Kite being resurrected took something away from Gon. The idea that he no longer has to deal with the results of his actions because, hey, everything turned out pretty okay. Kite's alive, despite the brutal murder. But I honestly don't care too much about that because it all just brings Gon full circle. He starts the series pretty much exactly where he ends it, as a relatively innocent, non-Nen-using child, but having gained the knowledge of who his father is. In the end, Kite living doesn't offend me in the same way that a lot of authors bringing back characters does. The Shadow Beasts weren't bad Nen users. They were just overconfident and unprepared. You know, I would argue that being both overconfident and unprepared is exactly what makes you a bad Nen user. Like, forget all of the actual underwhelming abilities like the Worm Dude and Mr. Spiky Hair and the guy who used Nen to put sacks of leeches in his body, that guy. Forget all of that for a second, because as a Nen user, you have two options. If you're going to walk into a fight unprepared, then you practically need to have have a doctorate level of understanding of Nen combat so that you can quickly analyze and adapt to any situation presented. It's either that or you don't get into the fight to begin with. And the Shadow Beasts were the worst of both worlds. They had minimal understanding of Nen, probably thought that they knew a lot more than they did, potentially victims of the Dunning-Kruger effect, I suppose, and they failed abysmally as a result. It's a very rare person who can just stroll into Nen combat without any knowledge for the opponent. You would need to be either a Kurapika level genius or a Hisoka level instinctual improviser. Hunter x Hunter should have ended when Gon found his father. You know, Togashi himself actually kind of agrees with that, because there's a famous interview where he said, "I do intend to finish it. Although you can say that at one point in the story, where Gon meets Jing, I have completed the story once." As a Jump reader myself, I also remember having thought, shouldn't this manga have just ended here? So Togashi actually confused himself with his own story. And a world probably could have existed where he did end Hunter x Hunter there, but continued the story of the world in a sequel series starring Kurapika or Jing or whoever, which is essentially what happened anyway. But it's also worth noting that Togashi went on to say, "But Hunter x Hunter as it is now has a lot in it that makes me want to keep on reading, even from my own perspective as a reader. And from my perspective as a writer, there are still many things in it left that I want to write, that I would enjoy writing. And so if anyone would be willing to enjoy this ride with me, that is all I can hope for." Basically, he still has a passion for the series, a passion for quite specifically writing the series. And contrary to popular belief, he is probably far more grateful to fans who continue to read at this point than many other mangaka. But what's your controversial Hunter x Hunter opinion? Let me know in the comments, or don't, and go watch another video instead, or do whatever it is that you do with your day.